Welcome to Prose and Cons, a podcast by writers for writers, brought to you by Precipice Fiction. Precipice Fiction would like to acknowledge the people of the Eora and Durag nations as the original custodians and storytellers of the land this podcast was created on.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Prose and Cons, the podcast where we feel like prose and sometimes we feel like cons. Might be leaning a little bit more towards the latter this morning, or this evening, this weekend evening, as it is for some of us. Today, I'm your host, James Healy, and I'm joined by Phoenix Raig.
Hello. Yeah, it's going to be another wet and wild one down here in the Precipice realm. Get your summer books, get in the pool, get your body nice and cool, and keep that book dry. I'm Phoenix
Stay
Raig.
paginated.
Stay paginated.
Oh, this is going to be a disaster.
It's already
maybe.
great.
And this is also joining me is Paddy Boylan.
Hello, I'm Paddy Boylan. I write a bunch, and I haven't told you guys, but if I'm lucky, I might have a job in the comms team for an Australian Minister of Parliament. Long shot. Long shot, because I think it's a job. Yeah, I know. Well, I mean, normally we do the introductions for ourselves, so yeah, the job's like a little above my station, but it's a writing job. You know, there's communications and writing.
Love
so
it.
I figure it's pros and cons relevant. Yeah, well, I mean, we'll see, but that'd be something. That'd be something.
Ooh. Hell yeah.
Very cool. Okay. And paginated means the number the pages of. Number the pages of. That doesn't make sense.
Oh, you are using it in the right
Oh yeah,
context.
it just means to number the pages.
On today's
Right.
episode, we're going to be talking about we're going to be giving you a bunch of definitions. We're going to be defining the words that you've always wanted to know the meaning of.
Really getting into that good stuff, really digging for it today. Today we'll be discussing character development and what makes a character interesting enough for us to want to write them. What are the components that we look for? And what is it that gives a character that kind of spark, that kind of intrigue that makes us say, yes, I'm going to take this character on a journey for 40 to 80,000 words. But first, I'd like to ask you lads what you're reading at the moment, what you're consuming, what have you been watching. And I'll start with Paddy. What have you been up to this week?
Well, I haven't been on the podcast for a while, and the last thing I read was Hyperion. Hyperion. No, Hyperion and its sequel, which I'm halfway through, which I don't think is as good.
Awesome.
But boy, is Hyperion good. I know you guys just did the episode on Dan Simmons, so there's probably not much I can say you guys haven't already said, but wow. Anyone hasn't read, it's kind of like a riff on the Canterbury Tales, but sci-fi, really mysterious, really big in scope, very, very cool. And I'm currently reading a biography of Hilary Mantel, rest in peace, who is, I'm going to say, my favorite author, and that's been excellent.
Amazing.
Nice.
Okay.
And that's me.
Hilary Mantel did Wolf Hall, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I just bought that on audiobook, so I'll be
I'm so excited for you.
coming in.
Brilliant.
I would have bought the sequel as well, but I actually wanted to not buy the sequel just in case I wanted to get that as to read it, get it as a physical book.
And you know what? I'm sure it's going to be great as an audiobook, but I mean, like, did you know I'm a fan of Hilary Mantel? Have I mentioned that? I love her writing, I know, prose so much that reading it, I think, is the, I mean, I haven't listened to it, but it would be the better experience. You can really sit with the language and how she crafts her language, and it's just so beautiful. But yeah, still excited for you.
And Phoenix, what have you been reading this week or watching?
Haven't been reading this week. I've been slowly listening to The Willows by I forget the author's name. What was his name, James?
Algernon Blakewood.
Yeah. He's late 1800s. It's an older author, older story. And kind of a grandfather apparently for kind of latter horror writers, sort of like you said. I think H.P. Lovecraft took inspiration from him, or Stephen King or something like that.
I think I can see H.P. Lovecraft's inspiration.
I could see a lot of H.P. Lovecraft in it.
Yeah. And then I think H.P. Lovecraft inspired King a lot.
So I've been listening to that slowly. I've also started watching Obi-Wan Kenobi, it's a Star Wars show. And I love it, but I'm also so bummed by certain things, like really disappointed in Disney for missing some really cool beats that have already been teed up for them by a lot of Star Wars canon that had been developed, and then they just decided to like, nah, we're not gonna do that. And it's just like you missed so many opportunities that were already set up for you, and I was so upset with them.
Doesn't Star Wars canon kind of reinvent itself all the time anyway? Just changing little bits here, changing little bits there.
I believe so, especially after, I would say after Disney took over, more so just because they started creating a lot of Star Wars media. So it's now just kind of like a organic little flowing thing where they're taking some liberties in some places, and that kind of happened before because you had like expanded literary worlds like novels and comic books and stuff like that that were expanding and exploring some of the further reaches and things. But I guess it just wasn't as present in the public eye then because it wasn't as now they have all these really nicely developed shows that are easy to find and easy to consume and stuff. But and apart from that, I've been listening to Fantasy High, a Dimension 20 real play Dungeons and Dragons podcast, which I've been very much so enjoying.
Nice.
How about yourself, James? What have you been up to?
I'm actually reading a lot of books at the moment on the kind of religions of Japan. I'm reading 2 books about Buddhism.
Because this is research, right?
Yeah, this is research for something I'm working on. So yeah, I'm reading up on Buddhism, and I'm also reading about Shinto, which is or Shinto, which is kind of another form of Japanese religion that kind of often isn't considered religion, just because of its various elements of it that make it different from other religions. But yeah, it's definitely a spiritual belief and a spiritual practice, a very common spiritual practice in Japan. So yeah, I'm reading up on that. I've just bought about 4 books on gladiators for the story that I'll be working on for the story that I'm writing for the next volume of
okay.
the next volume of the anthology.
Little tidbit there.
Little advert.
Listeners,
so
we are gearing up to write our second anthology. Our first one being The New Mythic, an award-winning anthology. And we're in the, what would you say, the nascent stages of writing our second.
Yeah. There is so I did a bit of research on because a lot of people cover gladiators, particularly after the film, the Russell Crowe film came out, I think in the 90s. A ton of people just churned out kind of stuff about gladiators that wasn't, they kind of leaned into the tropes and the kind of the myths that weren't quite real. So I was kind of digging around to find some that kind of got involved in like what was real and what was actually happening. And it's such a difficult subject to research because there's so little recorded about it, and it was practiced for so long. So much longer before we had any kind of writing. Like an awful lot of what we know about gladiators was because of like paintings on vases and stuff like this, and then only a few people wrote about it because it was kind of like trying to research football and understand what football was like hundreds of years in the future, when like nobody had anything like that. You're trying to put it together from like pundits having written about it and stuff like that.
They carried the skin of a pig.
Yeah. There'd be things you'd lean into and not understand. Yeah. So yeah, So yeah, I'm looking forward to digging into that research as well. So.
Wow. Oh, I have so many questions about that. Well, really, I just have one question, but all right, I'm just gonna ask it for whatever.
Yeah.
Is the lack of like research material just due to the fact that it was so long ago that it was before? Was it before they already had a written form of history at that point, right?
I think so. Kind of the last couple hundred years of the Roman Empire was when recorded history became like kind of when our recorded history began. But there was hundreds and hundreds of years. I think I might be going out on a limb here. I think maybe not 1,000 years, but hundreds and hundreds of years of Rome and Roman practices prior to recorded history being a thing. And the only thing that they would have wrote down at the time would have had to have been chiseled into rocks. So paintings was a lot of what we had to go on like that earlier Roman period. So everything that we mostly know about Rome is from kind of the later period of like the Roman Empire. But the Roman Republic was going on for so long before that. And obviously, like as a practice, it would have changed so many times, and it would have been a different, people's attitude towards it would have been very different, and how the culture changed how people interpreted violence, and changed how people interpreted slaves, and changed how people interpreted everything like that. So
right,
trying to partly pick a time period, but then also trying to be like, what is it? How does the story function that people view it this way, people view it that way? It's not a massive change either way. It's just that there was one period where there was like everyone's heard of Spartacus and the slave revolt. Kind of like after that period, everyone's attitude towards slaves and gladiators, there was a lot more tension there because people became more afraid of obviously of slaves and of what they could do.
And how are you picking which characters to focus on, and sort of which ones grab your attention?
Very good. Very good.
Sliding in.
Yeah. Well, like obviously there's the character as a gladiator, partly because I kind of wanted to write from the point of view of someone who like would have to get out and stand out in some kind of amphitheater in front of the whole crowd and fight with a sword and a shield. It just seemed really wild to me. And I spent a bit of time.
Also, full permission to talk as little as you want, because I also don't want to put you on the spot to reveal any of your story or whatever. Like, absolutely, whatever. Yeah.
And it's still a character that is developing, so I don't have a full answer, but I spent a bit of time thinking about how did this character end up a gladiator, because we all know the Russell Crowe story of him being enslaved and stuff, but there was a bunch of different ways that people ended up becoming gladiators, up to like even including like Roman citizens who like owed money and then had themselves join a gladiator school. So they essentially entered into kind of slavery for a period of time to pay off their debts and stuff like that. And an awful lot of people end up gladiators because they were sentenced to death, or because they had committed crimes that resulted in them getting kind of thrown into the amphitheater, essentially as executions, or even as just sport and entertainment for people. So that is kind of an angle that I'm taking on the story, that we often think of the gladiators as being these like celebrated sports stars, which in one essence they were, but in another essence they were criminals who were sentenced to death, who people used to watch them basically fighting each other as entertainment, if you know what I mean.
Public execution,
yeah. And like sometimes the executions were dramatized or kind of theatricalized, where there was a bit of like almost a play being played out, but in this play, like if the extras all died in the play, you know what I mean? It's kind of stuff like that. And people were thrown in with like wooden swords to fight kind of more celebrated gladiators and make it look as if the gladiators were really good, but these people just had wooden swords and the armor was probably not real and stuff like that. So it's a lot of stuff like that happening. So really, really wild thing to try to get your head around.
I'm very excited for your story, because this is all very cool.
Well, when I think of a character in that situation, but what I imagine is them kind of caught between the like, this sucks, this is essentially a death sentence, like I am a slave, but also hey, look at all this attention I'm getting. I mean, I don't think there's many people that wouldn't stand in the middle of that after they've been victorious and kind of just soak in the adulation of the crowd. That feels like an interesting tension at the heart of a character to me.
Definitely, yeah. Also, like an awful lot of the elements of writing about slavery from a time period when slavery was kind of just considered normal. Like a character wouldn't really have the presence of mind to be like, oh, this sucks, I'm a slave, because their journey is kind of like, this is what happened. So it's strange to kind of write about it from a modern context and trying to figure out how does this person perceive their position in the world now. Like, will they be looking at it like, oh, this sucks, people can tell me to walk out there and die and I have to, like, do they have that frame of reference, or is it just this is the position I'm in, like in the same sense, if you know what I mean?
I imagine anyone that's staring down the soon-to-be death would have some feelings about that. I get what you mean, but I don't think it's too much
Yeah.
of like a modern take to say like they would have appreciated that it's a really bum situation to be in, and that
But definitely
the
that. I think it's more the I guess it's more writing the relationship between the person who is the slave and the person who can tell them what to do, because there was not a lot of pushback, if you know what I mean. It was kind of just, I've
It's
been given the
more,
order, now I
yeah.
do it. You know what I mean?
Mm.
So there was a sense of, if you were told to do something, I don't know if there was a sense of, oh, I have to do it now because this person told me. I think it was just the natural way of things was the order has been given and now I do it, if you know what I mean.
To me,
That's
it
a way
sounds
to
like
try to get your head around.
they'd be like scared and kind of bummed, like whatever, quote unquote, bummed because they're about to go into the gladiator pit, and that's a very normal human, like, I'm scared I might die, blah blah blah. But then behind that, their relationship with being a slave, like slavery itself, it might just be more like, but this is how it is. What choice do I like?
Yeah.
It might not be as the normalized opinion would be less so like I'm going to fight the slavery, and more so I'm scared of my circumstances of needing to go into the gladiator pit. But this is where I don't know, just a guess. Just because slavery was more normalized then, I guess, or
Yeah.
I don't know.
So it's challenging to kind of frame that in a way that's realistic, because obviously you're I'm waiting for the character to like push back. Obviously he's like, it makes so much sense for the character to argue, and I have to remind myself that like that wasn't the context of things happening. The character couldn't argue with this, so the dynamic of the relationship there is it's challenging to write it and make it feel interesting, because obviously the drama is in the conflict.
Yeah.
So I have to find ways of writing that relationship where it's makes sense, or it's authentic and makes sense, but that's still interesting enough. So
yeah.
But yeah.
That's really in terms of creating characters from historical context, it is a bit like so I did another episode for people listening. There's another episode I did where it was an interview with CM Kozeman, who does a lot of paleo art, which is basically you take dinosaur remains or remains from animals that have long since gone extinct that we don't have like actual photographs of and things like that, and you, based on the structure of based on the remains and the context of what we do have, people speculate and create art of what they think that dinosaur, that creature would look like. Jurassic Park is paleo art because they are speculating what the skin and the texture and all that would look like. Some of these may have had elaborate feathers or fur or whatever it is, you might not know. So creating characters from historical events, it really is much so an exercise of that, where we take the context we have and we have to kind of speculate and put these dressings on what we can, like, from our perspective, literally thousands of years later, maybe not quite thousands, but hundreds and hundreds of years later, almost thousands. We have to speculate what the mindset of a person in that time would have been like. And I mean, not only has like time literally changed, but even our language, how we communicate ourselves, the vocabulary we have for what, like, there are some concepts that are so normal to us now that might not have even had words for them back then because they hadn't thought about it that way before, or something like that. Like, our vocabulary very much so shapes how we perceive things. And if something has not yet been perceived and the vocabulary doesn't exist for it yet, it's not even in the psyche of the time. It's a really cool exercise.
I mean, obviously, like, doing that to someone that lived X number of years in the past with a world that's completely different from ours is an extreme example, but we kind of do that every time we write a character, right? We're always inhabiting, when we write a character, we inhabit someone whose perspective we don't have. We need to make assumptions about how would this person see the world. I mean, it's always, okay, this is the expression that came to mind. It's always wearing someone else's pants. But that's not a real expression. But we'll go with it. We're always wearing someone else's pants. When we... I don't know. Shoes? I just wanted to step into the pants of that gladiator in that moment.
Yeah.
Skirt. I think they were skirts.
I like pants.
Well, okay, no, we'll say pants. This gladiator wears pants. But that's also what interests me about writing a character is When I think of the most interesting characters I've written, it's characters who temperamentally or maybe ideologically or blah 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 blah, I really don't have anything in common with. And the fun part for me is trying to get into their head and work out how this person ticks. Like I wrote a character who was more or less a sociopath and a really bad person, but I want to just like make them just like the grinning villain. You know, what
Yeah.
humanity do they have? How do they work? Why? How do they self-justify? Stuff like that. That to me is that's the meat of writing an interesting character. I don't know about you guys, but
Yeah. No, 100%. That is something I really enjoy. Like if there's a challenge in writing out a perspective that is completely alien to my own.
yeah,
And
but
there's something about
fun as well.
trying to it's fun definitely, and then like kind of trying to figure that out and see how the nuts and bolts of that attitude work is really fun. But those kind of characters are much easier to play off characters who are more than similar to you, because you can easily write a character who thinks the same as you, and if that's the character that's in opposition to this character, you've got a very big gulf between them, but a dynamic that you can play out quite well. I just think there's a just on what kind of Phoenix was saying is that I found when there's a historical context there, you're slightly limited. I guess there's kind of like a little bit of rules in place where you're like, I'm inhabiting a completely different character, but because it's historical, I'm like, I know that they would have had certain attitudes. I know they wouldn't have had certain attitudes, and I'm trying to find the balance between how you have to make them in some way relatable to a modern audience. Like their sensibilities have to be somewhat different from the time in order for them to seem relatable. Because you can't write about like someone who's completely immersed, because you'd spend so much time just trying to, even just in terms of storytelling, you'd spend so much time just trying to get across each part of the personality just for the character to make sense before you even take them on the journey of the story.
There's always going to be elements though that we have in common. I mean, even like loving your children, that's a thing. Like not liking unfairness. Like I think even with a really really radically different culture, you can always find those things that we share in common and work from there.
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess you can imbue a sense of relatability. Yeah, through having them really. Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good piece of
But
advice.
even then, and this is where the exercise just gets really fun. It's like, what does loving your child look like in that context? Because the expectations put on children at that time were fully different than what's expected of them now, where it's like,
a lot more
you're born, time to work. Like, I don't know, whatever it is, whatever it might be, the expectations of child are so radically different that the expression of love towards that child would likely be different, even though it's like at the core there's that instinctual sort of relatability.
This is why historical fiction scares me. I know both of you guys are taking stabs at it more or less, but I don't know. I feel very nervous about it.
My stab is very fictionalized, so I'm safe. It's like, nah, it's not historic.
Yeah,
I do. Yeah, I try to make it as fictionalized as possible. So I'm kind of like, don't hold this. Like,
what else can we do? We're not historians.
But I think what you find when you start researching, you start to get a handle on things. There's always more research you could do, because you always feel like this could be an ocean of things that I haven't touched on. But just try to find the story within it, and then see like, what can I work with. All right, I wanted to turn it over to you lads and ask, what are some qualities or what are some elements that you need to find for a character in order to make them work for you, or in order to make them interesting and intriguing and big enough to write about? Paddy, I know you were talking about character you wrote who had some sociopathy going on. Is there other elements or other things that you look for in characters, or things that you put into a character to make them more interesting?
I don't just look for sociopathy. I look for a range of different traits. No, I'm just messing with you. It depends whether it's going to be a background or foreground character. A while ago, I mean, our introductions for ourselves weren't the most comprehensive, but one thing I do is teach high school age students writing, and we did a class on character arcs. One of the things we talked about was, so do all characters need character arcs? And we came down and was like, if it's a main character to your story, yeah, you probably want to give them an arc, generally speaking. But if it's a minor character, someone who's only in it very briefly, they can probably get away with not having an arc. You know, if they're one of those one note, deliberately two-dimensional characters, like this is this wacky character who works in the bookstore, and that's just who they are. So what I look for in characters that I want to write, it really depends what position they occupy. If someone's front and center, yeah, like a lot of depth and complexity, and maybe even some traits that are at war with themselves. Like they're really kind, but a certain act makes them really angry, and so that I don't know, you insert cool at war with self character here. But for a minor character, it's more just someone who's a fun trope. Like sometimes I'll meet someone out in the world, or be watching TV or something, and I'll see characters like, well, that's interesting. I could take elements from them and twist it around. Yeah, so it depends. Those characters are like one note characters that can be really fun. The character is just like they've got one thing and that's what they do, and we don't see it often enough on the page to get bored of it. I don't know if you guys can relate to that at all.
I know someone who is a complete one note character.
Are they actually though? Or do you just not see them enough to?
I've never seen
at least
him.
Around you.
Yeah, well, yeah, definitely at least around me.
They might go home and like play Stravinsky on the piano, and just weep silently to themselves.
I'm sure he has a universe within himself. I'm sure he has a whole wide range of personal interests. But every single time I've seen him, all he talks about is sports, specifically like Irish upcoming sports events. I've never seen him make any other comment that is related to anything else. And I'm someone who doesn't watch football. I don't follow the sports. I don't know what teams are playing and what games. It's all he ever talks about. To the point that I find it hilarious. You just see him and he's just like, "Up Galway," and I'm kind of like, "Okay, I guess Galway's playing."
That's exactly what I mean. People like that who are just like they've got this thing that is completely accidentally quite funny or interesting, or yeah.
I find for me, for characters, this is where having a little bit of a plan can be helpful, because otherwise it becomes very easy. If you're a pantser predominantly and you're letting the scene play out, and kind of like sometimes characters pop in, and they become, I find that it's very easy to start to collect a lot of characters very quickly. And because it's like, oh, they're in this scene and I need some wacky scenario, or I need something to reflect this element off of, I'll throw a character in there. And then so you bring this character in and to reflect this one thing off of, but suddenly you have another name for the reader to remember, another name, another person that the reader is wondering, like, is this a person of significance or whatever?
Yeah.
And you don't always have to give them a name or something, but I don't know, it can be very easy to just like, oh, I'll bring in a character to reflect this thing, and then suddenly you just end up with a lot of characters. And especially if you're like, if that becomes a default of, I need something to reflect the main character off of, I'll bring in a character for this, then suddenly you have a series of scenes where new characters are popping in and out of existence, and it becomes kind of like, I don't know, it just becomes a little bit empty at that point. Then you have a lot of characters that are just pure literary tools, and that takes credibility it takes the humanity out of the character. So your characters it's like a less is more sort of thing, and you start to like diminishing returns on your characters, I think, starts to happen. So I found myself like, I let myself do it a little bit, but I do pump the brakes at times and do have to think like, all right, I'm actually going to recycle. If I'm going to need this character that's kind of similar to another character, I'm going to recycle the character if it makes sense, as opposed to introduce another character for the reader or something like that. I also notice, like, I feel like it's very tempting to, within the broader collective media consciousness, there's a bit of an echo chamber that can happen where you have someone that puts out a book who they plan their characters out. Like, let's say they have like full backstories, full arcs planned out for every single character. But at the end of the day, the reader only sees what's on the page, and they see the things that they like about that character, which might not be everything that exists for that character that the author like laid out to write that character. And then that person that read that story goes on to then create a character that's based on this they're basing it off of the tip of the iceberg that they read. So it's like that tip of the iceberg can slowly get smaller and smaller, and that's where you get like these tropes that are just like empty cardboard cutout characters, because they're based off of tropes that we've seen, and it's been in an echo chamber for so long that it just distills down to this nothingness. And it's very apparent to me anytime I'm writing a character, or sometimes when I'm reading someone else's characters, like I'm like, who is this person? This person's just loud. They're coming in here. They're not bringing anything of substance. They don't feel human at all. Like, and I can't. And
I was going to
I
push you
have
for an example if you have any, or even maybe a loose example.
Yeah. You get a lot of people that I guess one temptation is the sort of like fun, wacky best friend archetype that comes in and is like, this is the opportunity to, like, you have your main character, which might be a bit more dramatic, a bit more human. And so the wacky friend character archetype that's where the reader or the writer feels that they can just let off steam and stuff. But what ends up happening is they get this just hyperactive fount of energy that doesn't feel like, no actual person really behaves like this, where they're just like, everything's a quip, everything's a very dramatized like gesture of the hands, or everything's a skip and a step. I'm like, so it's like sometimes I have to tell people, like, pull it back, like give them a little bit more dimension, and then that will make it's that less is more diminishing returns thing, where if you pull it back, the moments where you do have their energy spike a little bit will hit even harder, because they have that foundation. It's the same with exclamation points. It's like less is more. Pull them back, use 10% of the exclamation points you're using, and that 10% is going to hit 100% harder. Yeah.
So yeah, totally. To your second point, to your first point, I mostly agree about having lots of characters, and you don't want to just introduce new characters every time you need like a new scene to bounce off of. However, do you guys know the Coen brothers, the directors of the Coen brothers? They did The Big Lebowski and endless other films. I love their films. That's kind of their shtick. Like, what they do is just like introduce these throwaway characters who are just these very eccentric oddballs, and you only ever get one note and then they're gone. It's like, I do agree that you probably want to lean away from that, but I think it can be done really well, because
it's not a hard rule.
Yeah. I love those Coen brothers minor characters so much. It's like, that guy could have a whole film written about them, but we only see them in one scene about Boylan.
I have seen it. Yeah, like I've seen it used effectively to give a sense of a world. A book that I really like by John Connolly, I think it was actually his first book, Every Dead Thing, involves he's a private investigator. He's searching for a missing girl at one point in the story.
A good name.
Every Dead Thing.
Yeah.
Or John Connolly. Yeah, Every Dead Thing.
I mean, John Connolly's fine. Every Dead Thing is compelling.
He's he's written about like the criminal underworld as someone who recently read the book was kind of giving me feedback, and they were saying they felt it was almost like otherworldly, like you're stepping into this, there's the real world where everyone lives, and then there's the underworld, like the criminal underworld, and it's slightly heightened, and it's slightly it's definitely not cartoonish, but it kind of feels like a different world. And there's definitely a point where he just meets a series of one-note characters as he's following the breadcrumbs of information, and he's stepping in and out of the two worlds, if you know what I mean. And each of the characters in the underworld, they're very kind of, I guess, idiocentric and kind of one-note, this type of person. And then the normal world characters are kind of normal, just the lawyer, or it's this or it's that. And
they're like characters as world building, sort of like each of these characters expresses something different about the world.
I would see it as characters, as world building, but like you said, they're very one note. But then you put three of them together, like he meets this person, and then you're kind of like, I get a sense of how the underworld works. And then the character, he goes off on he then immerses himself fully in the underworld to do the investigation. But at that point, you've gotten a sense of, this is not our world. You know what I mean? Once you cross that line into the criminal side of things, you're meeting people that don't fit what you'd expect anymore. But again, you have true one-note characters, so quite interesting.
It is just developing that is just a skill that comes with doing it a lot, is like being able to know, it's just bringing that into the consciousness a bit more. So it isn't just my default is I bring in another character in order to get across this thing. And you can actually start to evaluate it and be like, is this actually adding anything to the story? Or can I do this a different way that would actually be more interesting or anything like that? And you kind of get a sense for that. And a lot of that, sometimes you might find that you're pulling characters out because it just wasn't needed.
Yeah. Something I quite like in characters and developing a character is to write a character who is in some way has some kind of alienation from their culture or from their society going on, something that makes them, maybe they view things differently, or they maybe don't understand something that everybody else understands, but they have a different take that makes them, on the one hand, it's a good lens to view a culture through if you're writing about a strange culture.
Yeah.
And if you're not so much doing that, I think it's good to have a character who's maybe just not quite getting it or not quite wrapping their head around something.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it can make them behave in unexpected ways, partly to surprise the characters and partly in a way that'll surprise the reader.
Yeah. I mean, how many video games start with you wake up in a strange area, you're like from a different land or something, you've got amnesia and you need to rediscover everything. It's a trope for a reason.
Yeah, definitely a great vessel for picking up on a different world or a different culture firsthand. Yeah.
When you talked about crime as well, I mean, something that I think interests everyone is writing characters with lives that we would never normally inhabit. I mean, when we write criminal characters, there's sort of this voyeurism to it where like we probably don't want to be doing these things. We don't want to like put concrete shoes on anyone. But when we write about these characters, we can sort of play in that space. You know, we can like, what would it be like to be, you know, a violent mobster or something like that? I feel like it's sort of a safe way to, I guess, just explore those thoughts and those ideas, you know?
Yeah.
It's like actively creating our own simulation as it's...
Yeah. Yeah, it actually, yes, it is. I think that's a pretty good way of putting it. It is like that.
Stephen King, I'd seen an interview with Stephen King there recently, and they were saying, like, you know, what is it that makes your stories good, or what is it do you think get people's attention? And he was saying taboo, like he tends to write about the things that other people maybe aren't going to write about. And he was discussing Pet Cemetery, and he was saying like the subtext of Pet Cemetery, like is a family that you lose a child. And he says that in that story, he kind of follows that family along that journey. And then like obviously the family goes out, and I think the father digs up the grave and tries to like bring the child back to life and stuff.
Hang on, are there spoilers here?
No, I think that's the main setup of the story.
Just checking.
Yeah. But he was saying like that was something that like a lot of people wouldn't talk about or other people wouldn't write about and stuff. So he was saying that was something that like you went along on that journey with that family, and it was like you're saying it's not really something that people would ordinarily, hopefully not a lot of people would, most people wouldn't experience that. So that it'd be something to read about and kind of empathize and go through that experience and stuff with as well. So
we'll also get a thrill out of, I mean, like it sounds awful to say, but when we read something like that, there is a certain thrill that comes from like, I'm reading this taboo thing, this forbidden thing that is so separate to my experience in the everyday world.
I guess that's a big part of tragedy, and that's probably a big part of why people like breakups and stories as well, like the heartbreak. You bring two people together, but it's never started once they're together. 100%. Like you can never stay. The story can't just continue like that. It has to it has to be broken down again.
Yeah. So I guess that's actually another
couples. Five couples in a gladiator ring, and we'll just watch them all. We'll just watch them all break up. Oh, it's the modern gladiator. I love it.
People would pay.
I can't believe you wore that shield today. I can't believe you wore that shield. You know how I feel about that shield.
They're gonna break up.
Okay, so also to that, writing characters that, you know, like, look, I could have this wrong. I never studied classics, but isn't the definition of a tragedy a story about a character whose downfall is sort of inbuilt within them from the beginning? So a character who's really hubristic with a fatal flaw, the tragedy is that they're undone by their own hubris and by their own flaws. So, I mean, thinking about it now, that's something that I love with characters, is you design a character as this tall Jenga tower of a structure because you know it's going to teeter and fall. You build a character with those inherent problems, with those inherent flaws, because, you know, we like seeing when people fail because we're awful. I don't
Yeah.
know if you guys do that as well. I'm guessing you do, James, because you've got some dark stories.
Yeah, it's definitely something I do like. I like the idea that the character's flaw could be their downfall. I think that creates good tension in the story, because then you're reading it and you're thinking, oh, they could succeed, but they could fail, and that failure is not because they've lost against the antagonist. It's because they have this thing going on with them which could jam them up. And as you read more of the story, you're kind of like, they're not really getting a handle on this flaw. Like this could impact them.
Yeah.
And I definitely do like taking stories in a. I'd like to think it's unexpected, but maybe if if too many of them starts to become expected. But yeah, definitely can take another tragic direction if the character creates their own demise, or if the
But by
character
that
lets
time,
their
the readers. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, so if the character lets their flaw get the better of them in the end, if they don't get a handle on it.
Yeah. Do you
I think
do that, Phoenix? Like, I'm thinking about tragedy in your stories, and I feel like you don't use tragic characters as much.
I don't use tragic characters as much, or if I do, I would usually, my instinct would be to, yes, something might be their downfall, but then what I then proceed to focus on is that overcoming of that downfall and sort of the rebirth moment, I guess. So it's like I'm less inclined to kind of end in that more tragic space where it's just kind of the focal point was that flaw kind of bringing them down. Yeah, no, I don't use a lot of tragic characters.
Because you're a well-adjusted, functional person.
But also I find it very cathartic. I also like to avoid sort of like drama. One thing that I just can't stand in a lot of shows, because it's been done a lot, and oh my gosh, just like when you have those moments where it's like somebody knows something that somebody else doesn't, and there's just this prolonged drama of them not just opening that channel of discussion and stuff, and the whole, like, episode or whatever might just be about that hidden information.
You're describing all of Bridgerton.
I cannot stand that. I'm like, do something more interesting. Enough tension points based on someone not knowing something that someone else knows. So like, I find it so cathartic as an author to just decide that that's not gonna happen. Like, you know what? I'm gonna pick drama points that are based on other things, or tension points that are based on other things. The Lies of Locke Lamora. That was a very cathartic book for me, because he had so many moments where that trope could be set up, where like the main character finds out something and he goes back to his crew of people that he's like had this, like, they're brothers to him basically, and it's like, oh, is he going to keep this information from him? And he never did. He always just like tells him everything, and the tension point gets strung on something far more interesting. And every time I was like, yes, like, thank you so much. We could talk about something else.
Do you think that's a deliberate step on the author's part? Like, I don't know, the way that you reacted, that almost sounds like the author knows that that's a thing and is like, look at me not do it. Look at me not do that thing.
I do not know. If he said that it was intentional, I would believe it, because there were so many moments where I really thought like, oh, he's not going to tell them, and this is going to be the, the fallout of the best friends, the tension point strung where later on they'll find out, and it's like, why didn't you tell us this before? And then they, it puts the story on such an autopilot that's been done so many times, where it's like held information eventually boils over, falling out, and then they overcome it and help them in the end. Like that's been done so many times. And it's like, and that's an arc that's going to repeat itself, but just do it differently.
So I was reading an interview with Irish author Sally Rooney, who wrote Normal People, and she was saying that she never comes up with characters individually. She said she always comes up with characters already within a relationship, or already within a dynamic with other characters. So they're never,
that's nice.
they're never by themselves. Yeah. So what I wanted to ask you guys, is there a particular character relationships or particular character, like, do you have particular character relationships that you like to write or that you like to develop in a story?
Gosh, I really want to have a good answer for this because that's such a good question.
Yeah.
No, it happens as it happens. But I love the idea of only ever writing a character in the context of a relationship, because people only exist in the context of their relationships
Yeah,
with others, in a
it's
sense.
a really,
So
really good place
I
to
feel like
start
I feel like that's the fact of the podcast right there.
from. Okay.
Listeners are going to take
That's
anything
really
away.
cool.
Yeah.
I have never thought of a character in that way, like kind of designing it from that perspective. I love that.
Yeah, it kind of bakes
Because
in
it
the
is,
I
tensions and the interaction points as well.
yeah.
yeah.
Ooh.
And it's going to happen anyway. Your character is going to have friends. They're going to have, they're also going to have an enemy. They're going to have different things going on. They're going to have probably a love interest.
I love
So,
that
gonna
question
come
for
along.
planning a character. Like, what friends do they have? Do they have a partner? What's their family situation? I don't plan my characters like that. If anything, I do sort of default to it is like that one character is that first sort of thing that starts filling in the map, and then you see the other ones sort of fill in around them as the camera zooms out.
Mm.
And they usually end up in relationships. But I do have a lot of well, no, I don't know. A lot of them obviously have relationships, but I do start from them as the focal point only, sort of thing.
I
But
have in the past
I'm gonna
written.
take that with me.
Yeah, me too. I really like that. I have written characters in batches, like when you have a point that you want discussed as a conversation. You know, that tool. You want to talk about something that's happening in the world, and so you have two characters that a third character walks in on having conversation about that thing. That's something I've done a bunch. So I suppose in that sense, yeah, writing those characters, and you immediately when you write them, you want to have them be different to each other and distinct and have like an interesting back and forth, but never as like a set rule.
Okay.
Wow.
Do you do that, James?
I definitely don't do that at the beginning. But something that I've noticed I do is that I end up writing a character who is what I would call them is just like kind of they're the straight man. They're the character for the character. They're there for the reader who like to understand, and that character is kind of playing the role that makes sense. And I tend to bring that character in because the character I started with is a bit too. I don't want to use it's a bit of a cliche to say like you're writing a morally great character. So every character should have a little bit of, no character should be one note, good or bad.
Yeah.
But I do think I tend to write characters that I feel are their personality or their maybe ethical backbone or what's driving them might be a little bit too much to kind of explain while also trying to explain the world and explain the story. So I tend to bring in another character who is more straight down. Their motivation is very clear, and their goal, what they're doing, and who they are, that's all very clear. And then this other character comes in, and now they can bounce off each other. Whereas I find writing that kind of odd character in a vacuum and then having them interact with other people doesn't work as well. I think the odd character should usually be bouncing off someone who's a bit more, like an odd couple kind of thing.
Yeah. It sounds
I
almost
do
like a
that
reference point. Like you've got the straight person
Yeah.
as a reference point, like this is normal, this is usual.
Yes.
And then the other person can
Yeah.
be read as in comparison to that quote unquote normal set of behaviors. And yeah, I've done that before, and I mean, poor normal character.
Yes.
They just get saddled with being just an average person in this world, but they're very necessary. Yeah, the normal character is necessary.
Yeah, I think if you're writing a selfish character from a selfish character's point of view, it's fun for me to justify within that character's head being selfish the whole time.
Yeah.
But that doesn't work well then unless you're actually writing from the point of view of a character who's maybe giving, or maybe they're a normal character, and now you've got this selfish character balancing off. It really contrasts the selfishness in a way that
yes,
much better.
In fact, the book I'm writing at the moment, which I haven't actually picked up for a while, and it's burning a hole in my mind at the moment. I really need to get back to it. But the main character is a doomsday prepper.
Sorry, this is Sovereignty, is it?
This is Sovereignty. Yeah.
Brilliant.
This is the novel that's in some kind of state of written. It'll get there. It'll get there.
Yeah.
But anyway, he's a prepper, and he's got some pretty extreme ideas about the world. And I hadn't really thought about this now, James, until you mentioned this, but his wife is deliberately not like that. She's what we would recognize as just a nice suburban person, and it's deliberately to see his actions and his descent into, increasing paranoia, spoilers, kind of how she would see it, right? Like it mirrors, hopefully, the reader's, what I intend for the reader's like reaction to be. Like, that's not normal.
Cool.
What are you doing? This doesn't feel right. Although, like, and something that is on my list for this book actually is to try and find more ways to make her interesting, because right now I don't think she exists as a detailed enough character. She is just kind of serving that role of nice, normal person. So, yeah. Next draft, need to find more ways to flesh her out and make her, more of an interesting entity in herself.
There definitely is a way of
Go ahead,
turning a foil, turning a foil into more of a
there we go.
Viewpoint character.
Yeah, because otherwise they're just sort of a bit of a nothing character, unfortunately. Or they can be.
Yeah. That's the thing that I was kind of touching on before that I feel like can happen, is if too many characters are used just to reflect the main character or just to reflect another character, suddenly you have all these little empty wisps of people floating around.
Yeah.
But if you do it well and are good at just coloring humanity in these brief little glimpses, if they are one-note characters just for a scene, then it can feel really good because they feel real, and they, we have those interactions in real life. That's something that happens that are just like brief little glimpses. But otherwise, you do just have to be careful when you're doing that, is because when you read it back, suddenly I find like sometimes just like, who is this? Like, the voice feels like nothing. The words feel hollow. Like, this isn't engaging at all. This person's empty.
Yeah.
And it's the process of writing a novel is so wild in that, because I've just finished part 1 of a novel I'm working on, draft 1 of part 1 of the novel I'm working on. And that's 7 chapters long, but I've written like, I don't know, maybe 5 other chapters that were fully thrown away because it was just me workshopping certain voices, and I'd write full chapters out and full scenes out and be like, yeah, this is amazing. Then I'd come back and like, no, that's not it. And I would have to keep iterating on it, and sometimes threw whole ideas away just to settle on what actually felt like a certain character's voice, what actual characters were necessary. And it was a pretty cool process of like just iterating down and actually asking like, who is this person? Is this their voice? Is this what they sound like? Or am I don't know. Then sometimes it's a very distinct feeling when I feel like I'm just on the superficial layer of a character, as opposed to when I really feel like I'm in their voice and actually like know who this person is and where they're coming from. And it feels different when I read it back as well.
I got a question for you guys coming off the back of that. So I don't know who said it was that writing his life with the boring bits taken out. Is that the quote? Am I butchering that? You know the quote I'm talking about there, right?
I've heard that.
Yeah. So, it sounds like when we write these characters that are, kind of nothing characters, and we think like, they're kind of too dull. I think that kind of is, like, then we're writing life with the boring bits in. How much of a sin do you guys think that is, though? Like, should every character we write, and I'm talking about those sort of disposable, they're in it for 1 or 2 scenes characters, should every one of those characters be this interesting, memorable entity, or can we get away with having some characters like, okay, this character is just a functionary?
I would say absolutely.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, because like the example I gave before, you had that one character. They weren't a one-time character, but their energy was so high, and it was because their energy was so characteristic. That was what made them feel unreal to me, and it was that unreality that made them uninteresting to me. So even someone that's like really big, really in your face, really like quote unquote memorable, made them I didn't care about them at all. So I definitely I actually like writing is just, or reading, whatever, writing is just life with the boring bits taken out. I actually love authors that take time in quote unquote mundane activities and find the humanity in those moments. I like, there's a lot in the boring or mundane for me that defines a character or builds relationship. And sometimes that's some of the stuff that pulls someone into a book the most, is those really just quiet, small moments.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. If let's say you have a half a page where a one note character just pops up, as long as it's doing something, I think it's worth it. Like you can have a one note character, but depending on how the main character responds to them, or if the one note character is an example of like the way things are in this world. I've seen writing advice on, bringing characters who are like just showing up for a paragraph and bringing them to life and giving them a bit of kind of impression on the page. They don't have to be like big loud characters, just if they have a few details about them which kind of paints this is who they are. And if their whole function is just to like, maybe they're just passing information to the investigator about what they're investigating, and all they are is just the delivery system of that information, you still maybe just one or two details about the character to make them feel real. And then that gives a sense, oh, this is what the world is like, or this is what the police precinct things is like, or this is what the chain of command of how the information is sent is like.
So is it like not every character needs like a wooden leg and a strange haircut and a very high voice or stuff like that?
Yeah, no, they can have like a slight reek of brandy off their breath or something.
That's
like
nice.
that.
That's a nice little detail.
Nice.
Yeah, particularly for like an autopsy doctor or something like that. So
yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Ooh, that's a compelling character.
Damn,
I like that.
James. Ooh, spicy. Also, now I do want to write a book where every single one-off character has a wooden leg.
I would feel
but it's not. It's never discussed. It is just this weird world thing where it's like
it's safety
there are a lot of
standards
people missing one leg. Yeah.
Sidewalk is too narrow and all right, yeah, I think we've covered some good stuff here. Paddy, did you have a quote for us about characters?
Why, yes, I do, James. This one is by a little author you may have heard of called Ernest Hemingway, and it goes something like this. When writing a novel, a writer should create living people. People, not characters. A character is a caricature. Ernest Hemingway.
Boom. Could not agree more.
Speaking of the reek of brandy on the breath.
All right, awesome. Well, thanks very much, listeners. This has been Pros and Cons. Thanks for listening. And if you enjoyed this podcast, be sure to leave us a comment if you're listening on YouTube, or leave us a like on Spotify.
And yeah, send us a message or something so that we can catch your name or something, because we do have some people that are fairly regular listeners. We'd be happy to just be like, Susan, this one's for you.
Yeah,
we got you.
We want to shout you out, Susan.
We want to shout you out, Susan. Let us know you're there.
All right. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
See you later.
You're listening to Pros and Cons, the Precipice Fiction podcast.